And at the time that I was commissioner, by the time I left, I was the sole fiduciary for close to $20 billion.
Do you remember what the CBR was when you started and what the CBR was when you finished?
When I started, it was somewhere around between 4 and 6, as out of memory. When I finished, it was about 16 to 18 billion.
So you added 10 to 12 billion to the CBR?
Correct.
Do you feel like you fulfilled your fiduciary
I
responsibility?
believe I did. Yes.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. And today, our guest is Anchorage Attorney Pat Galvin. Pat began his political career working for the Department of Natural Resources and Governor Tony Knowles' administration. He stayed on through Governor Frank Murkowski's administration, albeit in different roles at DNR. When Sarah Palin was elected governor, Pat was tapped to be her Commissioner of Revenue. And in that position, he crafted ACES, a more aggressive oil and gas tax policy that generated billions in revenue for the state, including that additional $12 billion that was added to the constitutional budget reserve mentioned at the top of the show. Pat Galvin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Representative Gray.
Where did you grow up?
Grew up in Placentia, California, in Orange County, down just south of LA.
What did your parents do?
My dad was a sales rep for initially aftermarket auto parts for a company that sold mufflers and shock absorbers in the Southern California area. And then he went out to be a independent sales rep, taking on different products and selling them in the Western region. So he traveled a bit more then. My mom was primarily a stay-at-home mom. She was a nurse who became a stay-at-home mom when she had 3 kids. And then she got into golf, and her social life centered around the golf club. And she became a officer and a paid staffer or whatever for the local golf organizations.
And did you grow up playing golf?
I did. That was one of my outlets as a kid, growing up, getting dropped off at the golf course on a Saturday morning and staying there and being on my own until the evening when Dad would come pick me up. And then got a job as a 13-year-old picking up balls on the golf range, and became a golf cart caddy and put them away at night, and then became a course marshal and worked at the course through my high school years.
Do you still play golf?
When I can. It's been infrequent being an Alaskan with 4 kids, so I play on holidays and trips outside and a little bit here in Alaska.
You graduated from high school in Placentia and then went to college in San Diego?
Yep. Went to UC San Diego. Thought I was going to be an electrical engineer. I was 2 years in the engineering program, then switched to computer science, and then I switched to economics and what they called management science, or what eventually became on my diploma, quantitative economic and decision sciences, which I didn't actually know what that meant. And it was a double major of that and visual arts, or photography, video.
So it sounds like you didn't plan on becoming a lawyer when you were an undergrad.
No. That actually came about in my last year. I was actually focused on the media side. So all my classes were video and photography classes and art history classes. And I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. And I didn't feel that I just wanted to go out and take some little management job and have a workaday life. So started looking at grad school options, and I had an experience the year before. My roommates and I moved out of an apartment, and the landlord tried to hold our security deposit, and I used the on-campus lawyer who helps students build a small claims case against that landlord, and had a great time. And we stuck it to her and got all of our money back, and eventually garnished her wages from the company that she was the financial controller for. So it felt like vindication, and it's like, that might be a good thing to do. So law school was an option, business school was an option, and film school basically were my three choices. And I decided to take the entrance exams for the LSAT and the GMAT, and ended up doing well on both. And Elise still had a year left, so by that point, Elise and I were together and wanted to stay near San Diego because she was waiting a year to graduate then, and applied to a joint program at University of San Diego, joint law MBA program.
So you met Elise while you were in undergrad. How did y'all meet?
So I was playing something called floor hockey. It's basically gym hockey, run around with hockey sticks and a tennis ball type thing. And on first day, you show up and your team is kind of being formed. It was a co-ed team, and so players were coming to the game and saying, "Yeah, I'm on the team, but I'm not sure which team it is." And so she showed up, and I said, "Oh, well, you must be with our team, so you warm up with us." And so we were warming up, and then my friend came, who was the organizer of the team, and said, "No, she's not on our team." And so then the other manager came, and she realized we were on opposite teams. So we were playing against each other, and then for the rest of that season, we'd see each other coming on and off the
How
gym.
old were y'all then?
20.
20.
So I guess we were probably 21, now that I think about it. So I hadn't seen her for a while, and then I ran into her. She was working at something called Soft Reserves, which was a place where you got your notes from your professor, and you buy a package of notes. And so she was working there. I was like, "Oh, hey, I remember you." And so I started walking away, and I was like, I don't know when I'm going to see her again. So I went back, and this is unusual for me because I was shy and not one to step out. And so we're actually having a floor hockey game tomorrow night. Do you want to come see us? And so she did. And then after that game, when she came to see me, I felt a little more comfortable and asked if she wanted to do something. I think she was working the next night, which was a Friday. And I said, "Well, maybe we can get together afterwards." So that's what we did. And we've been together pretty much ever since then.
So y'all have been together 38 years.
Yeah, just about, yeah, 38 years.
So
Almost
because
two-thirds
Elise
of
had
our
to
life.
stay one extra year, you were looking at programs in San Diego. And
Right.
that's in part why you ended up in the joint law school MBA program.
Correct.
And
And so at that point, I decided that would lead me to my job goal, which was as a sports agent or the general manager of Major League Baseball team.
okay.
So those were my primary goals.
And did you pursue that?
Yeah. Actually,
I'm just going to say for our listeners, I already told you this.
Yeah.
Googling Pat Galvin is not easy. There's a lot of Pat Galvins in the world. There's actually previous Pat Galvins in Alaska. There's Pat Galvin politicians in Australia. And it's complicated because Elise ran for Congress twice. And so you just get named in all these articles as the spouse. And so I don't have as much research on you as I like. I did not know that you wanted to do Major League Baseball.
Well, nobody would know that. That would be in an article. You're pulling out of me exclusives.
Okay. Well, I didn't know. I thought maybe you'd done something famous in Major League Baseball. How would I know? I can't find anything on Google.
Yeah. So I was planning to be a sports agent. I mean, that was the idea. And
Like Jerry Maguire.
And this was actually, so flash forward to, I had finished the law degree and ended up with another year left for the MBA, and decided to save money and move from the private USD, which was expensive, to the public San Diego State to finish the MBA portion. And at this point, our firstborn Cooper was already along, and so that extended an extra year. So I finished the first year of the MBA program at SDSU. And
I just stop. So y'all had a kid while Elise was in school and you were in law school?
so Elise was graduated by then.
Okay.
I was in law school. Elise had been working as a sales rep for a little binding company. And so we decided to create a San Diego distributor of the binding company. And that's what sort of sustained us from a meager income basis as students living in, cheap apartments and getting by. And so what we decided to do was going into the summer before my last year of the MBA program, we sold the distributor business and took that money to live on for a few months. And I went to a local sports agent and said, look, I'm a licensed attorney and I'm willing to work for you for free for the summer if I can just get a sense of what the business is like. I want to see what your days are and whether I'd like to be part of that industry. And so I did. He accepted that, and it was a 2-lawyer office. They had a number of players as clients in baseball, football, racquetball, basketball, golf, across the board. And I got to see what the daily life was like for a sports agent, and it was horrendous. It was not something I wanted to do. And this was...
Why was it horrendous?
You're completely vulnerable to the whims of your client, who are constantly being approached by competitors and others to tell them that you're not doing a good enough job. And the industry had changed in the previous few years, where it had gone from the agent negotiating your contract with the team you were playing for to a 24/7 promoter for endorsements and additional income from, signings or products. And the people around the player are constantly saying, you're not getting enough, you're not getting enough, you're not getting enough. And so they're constantly calling the agents and I'm not getting enough. And so your entire day is spent settling down these people who feel like you're not doing enough, and then trying to do something for them and never really getting either appreciated or a chance to take a breath. And it is 24/7. It's a constant stream. And then the industry itself lives entirely in a gray market, because the recruiting, the bringing in the clients is inevitably at the edge of legality, because you're trying to get these college kids to sign up with you. And in order to do that, you have to become known and friendly to them at a time when it's illegal for them to be talking to you. And so you find middlemen, and you're just constantly on that edge of what is going to get caught and what can you do to get a foot in the door for the next big prospect. And that didn't feel good. And then finally, the symbiotic relationship between the money advisors and the agents was very dirty and just not a lot of fun, because I was asked to constantly bring this check over to the Merrill Lynch office. And the Merrill Lynch office was sending checks back to the agent. And they were basically doing you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours in their relationship with different players, where the financial advisor was sending his clients that were unhappy with their agent to this agent, and this agent was sending his clients who were unhappy with their money manager to the money manager, and it all just felt dirty. And so that was just not an environment I wanted to be in.
So you did that free internship for the summer and decided this is not for you.
Not what I would do.
And then what happened?
So at that point, I had to go back to looking at, maybe I'm going to have to, by default, be a lawyer or a banker or something. And on top of all that, we were trying to decide where we're going to live. And we had identified probably a dozen places that we could see ourselves living in. And there was a book out. This is pre-internet days. And there's a book out called Places Rated Almanac. And it had the top 286 cities in the U.S. ranked across 30 different categories or something. And so we used that. I created a spreadsheet, and we selected our 10 categories that we felt were important. And then we'd go through and say, okay, Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, climate, it ranks 28th. And she put Anchorage, Alaska on it because that's where she's from. And I sort of just obliged, including it out of just respect, but I've had no intent of ever actually moving to Alaska. And so it became kind of a joke because it would always just about inevitably every category would be, this place was 16, this place was 8, this place was 22, Anchorage, Alaska, 225. And pretty much every category would be like that. And so we're getting close to the end of my year, and I have to really start figuring out what we're going to do for work. And so the easiest potential employer to find would be law firms, because at the law library, there was a big book, Martindale-Hubbell, big sort of encyclopedia of law firms. And so I went and I copied off all the pages for San Diego and copied off all the pages for Anchorage and copied off all the pages for, I think, another couple places, and went through. And at this point, so my MBA was in financial planning and taxation. So I thought that was going to be helpful on the sports agent side. And so the natural law firm group was the ones that listed estate planning as one of the areas of services they offered. And so copied off these places, highlighted all the ones that had estate planning. I set up a little mail merge database thing. And so Elise would enter all the addresses and such from the Martindale-Hubbell copies. And so we got them all in for San Diego, and then she got them all in for Anchorage and sent them all out and sent out my resume to a cover letter to a bunch of places, and basically never heard a single thing back from anybody in San Diego in particular. Heard very little back. Like, just cold calling resumes in the mail is not really a good way to get a job. So Elise's family arranged for us the old Mark Air flight certificates were out at that time. PFD, you'd get like 4 certificates or something for flights on Mark Air. And they flew out of, I think, Los Angeles to Anchorage. And so they sent us 3 of those. So Elise, Cooper, and I could come up for spring break. And so I started calling ahead, and pretty much every firm that I called would, the hiring attorney would say, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll meet with you." Because I'd say, coming up, going to be there for a week. Want to know what it's like to be a lawyer first off, because I don't know if I want to be a lawyer, and what it's like to be a lawyer in Alaska. "Oh yeah, sure, let's set up a time." And so I had pretty much a full schedule. And one of them that I called said, "Oh, that's funny that you call. We actually have an opening. I'd like to set it up as an interview." I said, "Oh, sure, that'd be great." So we flew up, and it was cold. It was probably late March, still breakup. It wasn't what I wanted to live in, but everybody was super nice, literally across the board, and ended up getting 2 job offers out of it.
During spring break.
During the spring break. To start
right
in June or July. And it had happened that the day before we left, I actually got a call from a San Diego firm that said, "Hey, we've got a opening. We saw your resume. We'd like to schedule you for an interview." So I'm going to be gone next week, but I'll schedule it for the day we get back. So I did that. So I remember flying back, and Elise was like, "Well, what did you think?" I said, "Well, everybody was so nice and really seemed like a place that I enjoy working, but I just don't think I can handle the cold." So we flew back next day, went into the job interview with the San Diego firm. First guy was fine. It was a 2-person office. Second guy was just a jerk. And he was challenging all my answers, trying to tell me I was wrong on everything. And I think it was sort of a good cop, bad cop thing. And it's like, experience an aspect of that type of environment with the sports agent. This is not what I want to do. So drove home. Elise said, "How'd it go?" I said, "Let's move to Alaska." And we never looked back, really. That was like it.
So that was like the late 80s?
That was the early 90s.
Early 90s.
Moved up in 93.
Just recapping, you didn't really plan on being a lawyer. You went to law school. I don't know how common is it for people to go to law school but not actually plan on being a lawyer?
I think it's not unusual. I think probably like 25% of the people are just there to get a law degree for other purposes.
And so that first job that you got in Anchorage, you were doing estate planning?
Well, no. My thought that I was going to be doing estate planning, but they kind of said, okay, that's fine. You can try to generate an estate planning practice. But in the meantime, the firm that I worked for did a combination of work for basically village corporations, ANCSA village corporations, tribes, which were just sort of growing, and municipalities. So our biggest client was the Northwest Arctic Borough. The firm was Copeland, Langley, Bennett and Wolf at the time. Doesn't exist right now under that name. And the attorney that I was primarily doing my work for was Dave Case, who was one of the primary native law attorneys. He had, quote unquote, written the book on Alaska native law, literally. Most of what I was doing was the stuff that kind of fell off of what Dave was working on. And within my first week there, Dave asked me, what do you know anything about land use planning? And I said, no, nothing. And he says, okay, well, you're going to have to learn, because we have a big issue with the Northwest Arctic Borough. They had just passed a zoning ordinance to protect subsistence resources. The state at the time, the Hickel administration, was threatening to sue them over usurpation of state rights and such. And we had to gear up our legal defenses for what we expected to be an inevitable lawsuit trying to stop the borough from exercising those rights on state land. Particularly, the primary conflict at that point was outfitters bringing hunters out to areas where the subsistence hunters usually have. This is what the Title IX of the state law has to do with the rights between what a home rule borough can do when the state constitution says that all rights shall be pushed down to the local government that are not retained by the state. And so the borough wanted to use that power to restrict who could come into certain areas, just like any zoning ordinance would. And it overlapped with fish and game management, because they could basically say no hunters are going to come into this region unless they get a permit from us and are basically monitored and regulated. And the state was like, you can't regulate game on state land. And the borough said, well, then sue us. And so the state was beating the drum saying they were going to sue.
And you were going to represent the your
borough.
firm was going to represent the borough.
Right.
Against the state.
Against the state.
So this is like your first week?
My first week, yeah, that was my first week.
And as somebody who grew up in Orange County and went to law school in San Diego to be a sports agent, was this like where you felt really well prepared?
Yeah. So it was like, first question was, what's a borough? And then, what's ANCSA? What's a village corporation? So it was a great place to learn a whole lot about Alaska in a relatively short period of time. And so I could read different sort of synopses and then go in and talk to Dave and the other attorneys and say, okay, explain this one to me. And it was a particularly dynamic time in some regards for a number of the issues that then played out over the next couple of decades, particularly as it related to tribal rights in Alaska. And then the other related aspect, the one that ultimately changed my life, was about 6 months in, after we were kind of gearing up on the protection of the zoning ordinance, we had a guy come into the office who said, I've been hired by the borough to redraft their local coastal management program. And we were like, oh, okay. Does that have anything to do with the zoning ordinance? And he said, oh, no. This is completely different. This is a state program, and this doesn't have anything to do with it. So Dave was like, I don't know about that. And he said, you better figure out what these have to do with each other. So I made a couple calls, and one of them was to Beth Gertula, who at the time was the assistant AG for the coastal management program, and quickly found out that the guy was completely wrong, that it had everything to do with the zoning ordinance and had everything to do with the way that the zoning ordinance might interact with state law, and that it would create a significant vulnerability if it was changed in certain ways. And so that then led to a deep dive into the state coastal management program, particularly from the perspective of local district, which is what they're called. And it was a fairly complex area of law that not a lot of people understood. And so within fairly short order, I became kind of the leading expert on the Alaska Coastal Management Program, and that generated work. And so I started working for other districts around the state, started getting contracts from the state to help with, at the time, they're going through a bit of a reassessment of what the Coastal Management Program was trying to do. It was about 10 to 15 years old at the time, and they were getting a lot of stakeholders that were unhappy with it. And so I ended up becoming one of the folks involved in trying to figure out what it was and then what it could do. And the group that led the Coastal Management Program was the Coastal Policy Council, that was seated primarily by the deputy commissioners of the resource agencies and then representatives from around the state districts. And Marty Rutherford, who was the deputy commissioner of DNR at the time, approached me and said, hey, so this is 1998. Knowles was just being reelected, and they were looking for someone to run the coastal management program through the Division of Governmental Coordination in the governor's office. And she said, I want to put your name up for that. Would you guys be willing to consider it? And I said, well, would it mean a move to Juneau? And she said, yeah. So I went home and talked to Elise. And at that point, the reasons why we had moved to Anchorage in part were to be close to her family. And
You had all 4 kids by that time?
no, we had 3. Cam ended up being born in Juneau when we moved to Juneau. And she thought, well, a little distance might not be a bad thing. And so moving to Juneau wouldn't be too bad. So we did. We made the leap. And I wanted to be out of the hourly work of being a lawyer. I just hated that billable hour world. And we jumped into working for the state. What
was your title?
I was the director of the Division of Governmental Coordination in the Office of the Governor. And so I had a division of about 35 people. We ran the coastal management program. We coordinated conflicts that might come up between the resource agencies, and we interacted with the federal government on any of the land use stuff, such as the Outer Continental Shelf activity or activity in the coastal zone that the federal government might be trying to propose. And so that was great. It was a great opportunity to come into the state at a very high level, because I was participating in the cabinet meetings and in the governor's office and interacting with each of the resource departments at the commissioner and deputy commissioner level. And, for a kid basically 6 years out of school, that was kind of felt like a big deal.
What happened when Frank Murkowski got elected governor in 2002?
So by that point, we had decided to move back to Anchorage. And so in 2000, there had been some health issues with Elisa's relatives. And so she wanted to get back to Anchorage. And so she and the kids moved back there, and I effectively commuted. I worked it out to be sort of 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off in Juneau and Anchorage, because the division had a office in Anchorage. And so every couple of weeks I'd come down to Juneau, and we did that for the last year of the Knowles administration. And as that was coming to an end, it was not really a sustainable situation. And so I started looking for other jobs. A big part of coastal management project work centered around oil and gas. It's just the nature of the state is that the most controversial and most consequential projects tended to be the oil and gas projects, and they all tended to be within the coastal zone. And our relationship with AOGA and other stakeholders was a big part of the program. And so I spent a lot of time working with Marty at DNR and with Mark Myers, who was then the Division of Oil and Gas Director, and was very intrigued by oil and gas and its relationship to the state. And so I went to Marty and Mark and said, hey, I'm looking for a job in Anchorage. Is there a role that might work for me? And I actually applied for a job as a unit manager in Division of Oil and Gas. And Mark said, actually, I have a different role that I want you to consider. And he said, I'm going to bring you in to run effectively the permitting. It's the plan of operations approval and putting together the lease sales. The guy who ran leasing and licensing was going to retire in a year, and so it would give me time to get up to speed on that, and then I would take over the whole area. So that's what we did, and moved back up to Anchorage full-time, moved into Division of Oil and Gas, and started working on oil and gas projects on the permitting and the leasing side. And then Murkowski won. I was in an appointed position, effectively a politically appointed position, exempt. And so there was okay, is this going to last? And Marty Rutherford was in a position where she would be able to stay on. She was Republican and fit with both the Democrats and the Republicans.
Were you registered partisan?
I was a Democrat, registered Democrat at the time. And so at that time, at least, the transitions didn't cut too deep into some of the more technical positions. And so Marty stayed on, which to a certain extent protected me. And they brought in Tom Irwin to run the department. And so fairly early on, I developed a relationship with Tom that was good. And so my position was secure. And right at the very get-go, Frank did a couple things that sort of upset the apple cart in a number of areas that I was involved in. One, in his first state of the state, he said he was going to abolish the Division of Governmental Coordination and move the Coastal Management Program into DNR. He was going to also move the Habitat Division out of the Department of Fish and Game and move it into DNR. And at that point, my previous number two at Division of Government Coordination, a woman by the name of Carrie Howard, had taken over for a good friend of ours, Ken Taylor, who was the director of the Habitat Division. And so she was in Habitat Division when this was happening. And sort of this mind-spinning thing, Carrie and I end up in a conference room at DNR told, okay, you guys have to figure out how we're going to move the Habitat Division and the Coastal Management Program into DNR. And we said, well, okay. Our first iteration was to explain all the reasons why that would not work. And Jim Clark, who was then the chief of staff to Murkowski and was the driver of these policies, basically said, I reject that. You're going to do it anyway. And so we said, okay, well, this is going to fail, but I guess we'll find the best, most painless way of getting it done, and then we'll see how long it sustains. So we did that, and within that world, they also...
Hey, basic question. Why did Frank Murkowski want to move those departments to DNR?
So there was a perception that was valid that within the state natural resource development, that there were the departments that were seen as encouraging it and
those that were barriers.
And that those are the barriers. And the Habitat Division was one barrier, and the ACMP was seen as another barrier. for a very set of complicated reasons. And so, and Jim Clark came at it with a very narrow focus on forestry practices. And the Forestry Practices Act had touted itself as a comprehensive permitting program for forestry activities. And those who operated within it and had some control over that legislation and that program always felt chafed by any instituting of jurisdiction by other entities. And so they felt that the Habitat Division trying to impose its will through the Coastal Management Program was somehow a violation of the Forest Practices Act. And similarly, ACMP in general was a violation of the Forest Practices Act. So Jim, as a Forest Practices Act perspective person, thought all that needs to be dismantled in order to have the Forest Practices Act proceed in the way that it was designed. And so that was really the primary motivator.
So instead of dismantling it, you'll just move it to DNR, and
move it to DNR, then it will be aligned philosophically with the folks at DNR who are also trying to encourage development for state resource purposes. And it will allow the DNR commissioner to exercise this balance between conservation and development singularly, rather than having a commissioner of fish and game butting heads with the commissioner of DNR. And so they made that edict, and it shall be so. And so that was done. The Habitat Division moved within DNR. Kerry was the director and tried to retain as much of the independence and the character of the Habitat Division, but it was now within the confines of the commissioner. And the commissioner was trying to, Tom was trying to do what was right, and yet it wasn't something that could be done easily because of the perception that anything that was done that overruled the line staff, even if the line staff were being unreasonable or extreme on a particular position, was seen as improper or wrong. And so it just made life difficult for everybody, really, without having a sort of a check and balance system. It had sort of the commissioner rules system. And that made for 4 years of conflict. So at the same time, we had a number of other things that cropped up. Coal bed methane came into Alaska, became a cause celeb, and I ended up being responsible for trying to make that something that could be fixed from a public perception standpoint.
What came into Alaska? Sorry.
Coal bed methane. So this was methane gas trapped in coal seams that is shallower than the associated gas with normal hydrocarbon creation. And there was a method that had been developed in the lower 48 to basically dewater coal seams, which would then release the methane. And you could strip the methane and produce it it becomes the natural gas that we would use in the Cook Inlet area. And there's a tremendous amount of coal resource in the Susitna and a little bit up the Matanuska. And so that became the starting point for a potential coal bed methane play. So a company came in, and the first thing they did was they convinced the legislature, primarily through Scott Ogan, who was then resources chair, to pass a bill that short-circuited the public process for leasing the shallow part of the state land for purposes of coal bed methane generation. And so there was little to no public notice, and the DNR had to offer these shallow gas leases throughout the Wasilla, Susitna Valley region. And folks didn't find out about it until the company came out and started drilling wells. And when folks found out that, and then on top of that, they realized that under the Statehood Act, the state, when it gave deeds to state land, was required to retain the subsurface resource rights. And so these folks who had bought tract houses or open homesteads found out that they didn't own the subsurface underneath their house, and they also didn't have a right to stop someone from drilling underneath their house. They weren't happy about it. And this is the Matsu, the laissez-faire, do what you want, don't zone me Matsu that just erupted. Because you have a conflict of, my house is my house. How dare you tell someone that they can drill under my house? And then you say, well, but you don't have any rules against that because you didn't want to have restrictions on what people can do around your house. And they said, but that was to protect me. Now I want to protect me from others. And so
I'm wondering who the mayor of Wasilla was around then.
I can't remember who the mayor of Wasilla was, but
it wasn't Sarah Palin.
She wasn't the one. No, she had been slightly before that, because at that point she was post Wasilla mayor.
Got it. But
and
it
actually
seemed like an issue.
No, so Sarah Palin actually was involved in this, because this is when I first met her. She was appointed to the AOGCC.
Right. That's what I was going to say.
And so,
and I feel like she would be siding with Wasilla residents.
And I think that was one of the areas of conflict between her and
oil and gas development.
And in particular, and I'm blanking on his name, former head of the Republican Party, Randy Rudrick. And so Randy was at the AOGCC, and when we were doing these public meetings to calm the public from the risk of coal bed methane, he was the one out there saying, as the commissioner of the AOGCC, we will not allow this because the wells will be drilled in such a way to protect any groundwater from being invaded by the methane. And then we had activists from the lower 48 coming up. For those who are familiar with the shale revolution and all of the
fracking,
the fracking and such, that was our first introduction to fracking, because they would have to frack the wells and then dewater them, meaning they would pump a whole lot of water out, and they'd have to do something with that water. And
what were they doing with it?
Well, at the time they were going to, I think they were going to just reinject it. So they're going to store it on the surface and reinject it. In the lower 48, they were creating big holding ponds and such that were causing issues for both agriculture and for livestock. And so there was a mess down there. And so rightfully, what we were asked to do was to put in place the standards that would give people a sense of comfort that the bad practices that were happening in lower 48 weren't going to happen up here.
Right. And you were working for the state. So you were in the Murkowski administration.
I was in the Department of Natural Resources in the Murkowski administration.
So you were trying to help get this methane out?
No, we didn't really. We were sort of agnostic on it because it was an exploration project. So we had no idea whether it was going to be economically successful or not. What we didn't want to do is we didn't want to undermine the confidence of the public in the state's management of the land. And if the public, in the form of the most conservative and pro-development region of the state, felt that the state was sacrificing their interests to run hell-bent after one particularly unsure economic development, then you lose the confidence of everyone in terms of the legitimate management of the state land. And so we were trying to get out ahead of it. Part of it was that the shallow gas leasing law precluded DNR from doing any studies ahead of time or any regulation of it. And so at that point, it was kind of with the governor's recognition that something had to be done. It was, okay, what can we do now that the horse is out of the barn to bring back public confidence? And so we put a moratorium on any coal bed methane activity until we had coal bed methane standards in place. We held a series of public meetings, public hearings to bring in public concern. We did trips to lower 48 to see what had happened down there and what were good practices and bad practices. And so then we wrote up a set of coal bed methane standards that we then put in place and said any activities would have to comply with these. At the same time, the Mat-Su Borough was passing a zoning ordinance that sort of adopted a lot of them as part of their zoning ordinance. And we kind of calmed everybody's nerves for a bit, but it was an interesting exercise in how both to understand the public process and kind of what's good public process, what's bad public process, and also for me, personal education on below ground drilling of wells and how it's done, what it all means, terminology, what's good practice, what's bad practice, and such. So that was all interesting. So that we came out of coal bed methane right about the time that the Stranded Gas Act stuff was ramping up. And so Stranded Gas Act created an opportunity for the state to enter into a contract with proponents of a natural gas pipeline to bring North Slope gas to market. And the contract could entail a number of different aspects of the state's fiscal relationship with the pipeline and the gas being produced.
The potential new pipeline.
And so the mantra from the industry was that they needed fiscal certainty in order to be able to advance a gas pipeline project. And when the negotiations began, it became clear that what fiscal certainty meant for them was 20, 30 years of locked in oil and gas production tax and no changes in the royalty, no changes in the way the units were managed. And from the DNR perspective, that violated what we felt was the state's sovereign right as the owner of the resource to manage its resources and set fiscal policy and so forth. From the folks who were then at Department of Revenue, they felt that it was a reasonable commercial approach to moving a project that was intractably stuck forward. And that conflict between those on the revenue side who were like, well, this is what they need. We got to give them what they need in order to move the project ahead. And the DNR folks saying, no, we are a full-on contractual partner of theirs, and they need to both live up to the terms of the leases. If the resource is developable, they need to develop it, and they need to do it in commercially reasonable ways. And
it's so interesting. It just seemed like the opposite of what you'd expect. You'd feel like the Department of Revenue would be interested in making sure that they got revenue.
Right. And I think that's the way they approached it, was that they saw it as a way of, we're going to get revenue out of something that we're not currently getting revenue out of.
Mm-hmm.
It was a personality thing as well, because Department of Revenue at the time, the commissioner was Bill Cordes Murkowski's commissioner, who was just looking at it from a businessman side of how do I get revenue for the state. And Tom, as the commissioner DNR, and Mark and Marty were looking at it more from a resource owner perspective. What would we do as the resource owner? Not as a sovereign of the state getting tax money, but as a resource owner, what is our obligation to make sure that we maximize the benefit of the resources that we own.
Which to me would be maximizing the revenue the state would receive. If you're going to take this finite resource from us, we should be fairly compensated.
And in fairness to the revenue folk, I think it was really a matter at the end of the day of, did you think that the best outcome would be coming by the state acquiescing to the industry's demands? Or do you think it would come from the state standing up to the industry and saying, you have contractual obligations, let's work out a resolution that recognizes our respective rights? And the revenue guys, in part because they had come up through the initial discovery of Prudhoe Bay and such, that there was a much more deferential approach to the positions and statements of the industry folk. Mark and Tom, having come from the industry side, Mark was an explorationist at ARCO. Tom was the one who had developed a couple mines, recognized that the companies were going to say what they needed to say to get the most out of the state. And we're going to, I wouldn't say lie, but they would shade the story in order to
maximize the company's profit
and their leverage over the state.
So this is obviously in the news now. We're talking about Gasline now. We're still talking about it 20 years later.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan, he just told us that when we're building this gas line, and the question is, well, what sort of revenue would the state get from it? The answer is like, well, that it's going to be marginal. It doesn't matter. The benefit to this gas line is cheap natural gas for South Central. There's no real revenue that's going to be coming to the state from it. The natural gas is cheap, and we're going to be sending it all to Korea and Japan. But we're going to just siphon off a little bit to take care of Alaska, and that's going to be cheap natural gas for South Central Alaska. And why are you asking questions about? And so it sounds like that people aren't crazy if they say, well, what does the state get for this resource?
Well, I first want to parse what I think Senator Sullivan probably was saying. And I wasn't there, so I don't know exactly what the context was. But what I'm hearing in the public discourse right now is confusion. And the reason is that there are two pipeline proposals that are basically the same thing, but two different phases of it. The primary phase right now is talking about phase one, which is build the pipeline for the South Central area. And in that regard, revenue is not going to be an issue. It's not the state's, any revenue the state takes off of that is going to be off the back of the ratepayers. And so it's kind of a circular thing. And the state's interest is probably to keep that as low as possible. So state revenue shouldn't be the concern of that phase. If it then expands into an LNG export project, then revenue will be a part of that. And there's a significant amount of revenue that will be part of that. The WoodMac study that recently came out showed it's like multiple billions of dollars that are going to be coming in, not annually, but overall the net present value has billions of dollars available to the state in terms of revenue. But those are two separate things and two different periods of time.
I mean, this was a Zoom call. It wasn't recorded, but I understand what you're saying. That's not exactly how I remember it. So it's the end of the Murkowski administration.
So Murkowski administration ends in acrimony.
Right. There was a lot of, he lost the primary badly.
Before that. So rewind the clock a year before that, and the conflict between the Department of Natural Resources and Department of Revenue reaches a head. Governor wants to go forward with a version of stranded gas agreement that the folks at DNR felt was giving up the state's sovereign rights. And in particular, would freeze oil taxes for 30 years for a project that was still speculative and uncertain. And so the state was giving up a huge amount and not getting much in return from the DNR perspective. And ultimately, it led to the commissioner of DNR,
Who was
Tom Irwin. So it come to a head, and so Tom, in order to preserve the relationship with the governor and others, decided that the best way to address his concerns was to send a legal request to the Attorney General and ask for an opinion on whether or not the draft of the Stranded Gas Act contract violated the state's interests, violated the state's sovereign rights, and enumerated a number of areas that was of particular concern. And so that was sent to the governor the day that the governor was going to announce to much fanfare that he had reached this historic agreement with the producers on the project. And the expectation was that Tom would either be fired or would quit sometime over the weekend. And so we all went and were listening to the press conference. And at the end of the press conference, the governor said, and this isn't without controversy. In fact, there's some concern within my team about this contract. And because it's such an important issue, I'm going to release the commissioner's memo request to the Attorney General. And we were just floored, just shocked, because it was done in order to keep this conflict in-house. And the governor, because they were paranoid about what Tom was going to do to make them look bad, decided, oh, well, they're going to release it anyway, so we might as well get out on the front foot. Now, we had no intent of releasing it on the DNR side, but they did. And so suddenly all the headlines were, DNR commissioner says the governor is throwing away the state sovereignty, blah, 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 blah. And so that was not a tenable situation. And a couple days later, governor fires Tom, and immediately 6 of the highest ranking DNR sort of career staffers quit. And that became a huge issue because they basically quit in solidarity that the governor was undermining the state's interests. And it was a big deal for that to happen. So it was in that atmosphere that you then go into the next legislative session that became the oil tax PPT session. And you also had the governor's race playing out in the backdrop of what would you do for getting the gas line going and all that. And that was Palin's kind of thing.
Right. And I guess like you weren't really part of it, but also in the background, I mean, there's like a Vico scandal happening, right?
So that was under the radar. Nobody really knew about that.
Got it.
Because what we knew was that the oil tax was being debated, that the folks who were advocating for the particular structure were the ones who had also participated in convincing the governor that he needed to just acquiesce to whatever the companies wanted. And so there was a huge amount of skepticism within the DNR group that the oil tax that was being proposed and ultimately passed was in the state's interest.
And Sarah Palin had been appointed to AOGCC, but, and I see it like it all is blurred for me. Something with Randy Riedrich and him being the head of the Republican Party and being on AOGCC and, you know, lots of, and her opposing this conflict of interest.
So from the simplest through line, when Sarah and Randy were on the AOGCC at the same time, there was an opinion letter by the assistant AG who advised AOGCC on a particular AOGCC matter where they were taking a position to push the company in a particular direction. And Randy sent the Assistant Attorney General's legal memo to AOGCC, which is typically covered by attorney-client privilege. It's not something that is released. It's not a public document. And Randy sent it to the representative for the oil company and said, get this. This is what we're hearing from the AG's office. And Sarah ultimately blew the whistle on that and said that Randy was violating his obligations to the state by revealing effectively confidential documents, internal documents to his industry folks to put them in a better position to
negotiate with the state.
Yeah. And she quit in protest. And so that created her sort of independent bona fides as it relates to the Republican Party, as it related to
because Randy was also
industry,
the head of the Republican Party.
Because he was the head of the Republican Party. And so it burnished the outsider credential that when everyone, by the end of the Murkowski administration, both Republicans and Democrats alike were sort of tired of him. He had made a number of missteps politically and otherwise that caused his support to evaporate. And he found himself in a three-way primary, and he was by far the trailing of the three, which was unprecedented for a sitting governor in a party primary to be in the teens compared to the other two. And so John Binkley and Sarah were the other two, and Sarah's star was on the rise primarily through her establishment of her independence, her, persona on the campaign trail, and I think a sense that we needed something completely new to break up the old boys network, as it were, as she would call it. As I describe for folks who want to think of oil and gas politics in the country as a Republican-Democrat thing.
Mm-hmm.
In Alaska, it doesn't work that way. That oil and gas politics cuts diagonally through our partisan politics, where you have on one side a large number of Republicans and a small number of Democrats, and on the other side, you have a large number of Democrats and a small number of Republicans. And that's what played out as we moved into the early part of the Palin administration.
And so moving into the Palin administration, I mean, you were still a registered Democrat. Are you still a registered Democrat?
I'm not today, but that's been more recent.
Oh, that's very recent.
Yeah, that's very recent.
So you were made a registered Democrat through this whole period.
Oh,
Did that ever cause a problem? I mean, did anyone ever question it?
I mean, I think there was probably some question internally, chafing within the Republican establishment, as it were, but nothing within like the folks I worked with.
How did you become the Commissioner of Revenue in the Palin administration?
So following the blow up that, the Magnificent Seven resignation led into a fairly dynamic period of state politics, particularly on the oil and gas political side, leading up to the 2006 election. And during that time, so I stayed with DNR. I didn't resign with the rest of them. And
why?
A number of reasons. One, I wasn't a public figure, so my resignation wouldn't have meant much in terms of adding any heft to the symbolism of it. Second, I had 4 kids, and I was the sole breadwinner, and we were living paycheck to paycheck, so that wasn't really a very attractive offer. And third, I would be more valuable to the team, as it were, by staying in the department and working to our aims from within the remaining Department of Natural Resources Division of Oil and Gas. And I think that did work out because I was, I think, influential internally on things like getting the Point Thompson development plan rejected at the end of the Murkowski administration, and being there to manage some things when the first pipeline spills on the slope started happening, and putting in some facility integrity oversight programs. But at the same time, we were meeting regularly outside of the department with the folks who had left to develop a strategy for how you would actually move a gas pipeline forward in the state's interest, something different than the Stranded Gas Act. It would be an alternative to the Stranded Gas Act structure. And through that effort, we sort of identified a path that we felt would be in the best interest of the state, and approached both campaigns at the time, Palin and Knowles campaigns, with it. And I think the Palin campaign endorsed it entirely. The Knowles campaign was like, yeah, okay, we could probably do that. And so we were basically well positioned regardless of who won.
Wait, so Knowles is running for a third term?
Yeah, Knowles was running against Palin. Yeah. And that was the weird thing, was that Palin was the oil and gas outsider.
Right, because our state constitution forbids a governor from being governor more than 2 in a row.
Correct.
But you can be more than twice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you have to rewind the clock a little bit.
Right.
And Frank comes in, and just before he came in, the Republicans who controlled the legislature passed a law that created a 60-day cooling off period from when a senator resigns to when the governor appoints. And the whole point was to not have Knowles appoint a replacement for Murkowski in the minute before the inauguration. Right. And so that Frank would be able to choose his own successor.
His daughter.
So he does that. He chooses Lisa over Sarah, and that created a little rift there that played out over a number of years.
But he did appoint Nancy Dahlstrom to replace Lisa in the House, even though she had lost to Lisa.
Yeah. And then 2 years later, Knowles ran against Lisa. And that was the first sort of knockdown, drag out between, Lisa as the Nepo baby and Knowles as the previous governor. And that was a close race. And then Knowles came back to run 2 years later for governor against Sarah. And the dynamic was odd because Knowles was very friendly to oil.
Mm-hmm.
And he was...
Sarah was ostensibly antagonistic towards oil, having resigned from AMGCC.
Rejected the Old Boys Network.
Right. And about to pass ACES.
Well,
I know. I'm not there yet. I know.
I didn't know about that yet. And frankly, oil taxes wasn't really on any of our radar. We were all about the gas pipeline. But Knowles was close to Bill Allen. And there was a political shaking up that was completely
That's so interesting.
different
I interviewed Disco Ray Metcalf for the podcast and could never release it because there were all these allegations in it. But I'll just say that you mentioning Tony Knowles and Bill Allen together, I was like, oh, maybe there are some footnotes from my Disco Ray podcast.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's the thing about Alaska politics are odd, and it's not a strict Democrat Republican thing. And in that era, it particularly was not a Republican Democrat thing as it relates to oil and gas policy, because Democrats, for the most part, in Alaska are not opposed to oil and gas. We need oil and gas to fund the schools and fund the programs that we want to see improve our state. But we also recognize that we can't just hand the keys over and let them run willy-nilly because of environmental conservation and fiscal issues that we need to stand up for the state's interest for. And so that diagonal cut meant that when Palin did get elected And our team, effectively from the DNR group that had resigned and carried through, was basically identified by her right from the get-go as her oil and gas team for her administration. Then we set up having to figure out, okay, so what roles does everybody play? And I expected to be playing a supporting role of some regard, but I got a call and it was basically that, okay, we've gone through and we've looked for who on our team would be the most appropriate for revenue commissioner. And you're the only one with an MBA in finance. And so we think you should be the revenue commissioner. And that was a shock. Like I never expected that.
Can you just explain what a revenue commissioner does? What your main role is?
So the role is, I guess, threefold. The number one role is as the fiduciary responsible for the various reserve accounts of the state. And so it starts with being a trustee on the permanent fund board, as a board member on the Alaska Retirement Management Board, and then as the sole fiduciary for a number of CBR and its sub-accounts, and for a whole laundry list of other funds that are managed by the Department of Revenue. And at the time that I was commissioner, I think by the time I left, I was the sole fiduciary for close to $20 billion. And then one of the board members managing the arm and the permanent fund boards that had between them, upwards of, I think at that point, probably $60 to $70 billion. So that's.
Well, do you remember what the CBR was when you started and what the CBR was when you finished?
When I started, it was somewhere around between 4 and 6, as out of memory. When I finished, it was about 16 to 18 billion.
So you added 10 to 12 billion to the CBR?
Correct.
Do you feel like you fulfilled your fiduciary
I
responsibility?
believe I did. Yes. And actually, that brings me to the second role for the commissioner, and that's identifying the ways of providing revenue for the state and working with the rest of the administration and the legislature on managing the state's revenue fiscal system. And so that was a big part of what I was doing, somewhat just because of the timing of it, oil taxes. And then the third part is more administrative. You have the other divisions within the Department of Revenue, whether it's child support or the permanent fund dividend division, managing those in a way that's as effective as possible. So that's kind of the three primary roles of the Commissioner of Revenue. We came in fully focused on gas line, and we were chafed by the passage of the PPT, the Petroleum Profits Tax, moved the state oil tax system from a gross-based system that had a complicated formula to lessen the tax burden on older fields, and moved it all into a net-based tax that we felt was susceptible to being manipulated and gamed by the industry through fancy accounting and hiding the ball. But that skepticism would kind of set aside because politically we needed to get the gas pipeline moving. And so we put together a plan which became AGIA, Alaska Gas Line Inducement Act. And that was the focus of 80 to 90% of our attention for the first 6 months of the administration. Near the end of maybe March or April of that first legislative session is when
2007
is when the indictments came down and they marched a couple of legislators out of the Capitol in handcuffs. And suddenly all of the rumors
This is
about
the Vico scandal.
So this is the Vico scandal, and the Vico scandal that's centered around the passage of PPT in the previous year. And so it upended a whole lot of stuff. So first off, the structure of the legislature was a little bit odd and unique because the Senate had organized for the first time in a while bipartisan majority.
With Lyda Green.
With Lyda Green as
Johnny
the president.
Oz.
And that had come about because of oil and gas politics.
Which is so interesting because Lyda Green hated Sarah Palin.
Eventually.
I
don't think they didn't start off that way.
Okay.
But what happened was the Republicans had 11 members that were elected to that Senate.
Ben Stevens had been the previous Senate president, and he was somewhat
he
tarnished by the Vico scandal.
And so he didn't run again. But they had 11 members, and there were, I want to say 5 of them who were philosophically aligned with our approach to oil and gas. Stand up for the states' rights, negotiate the best deal we can, don't just acquiesce to what the industry says they claim they need. And then the other 6 members were much more aligned with the industry's interests. And they did not, and then I guess that's not actually true. So there were probably 5 and 5, and then there was Liesl. And Liesl was kind of this hinge.
Liesl McGuire. Senator for South Anchorage.
And she could go in either direction. And so Lyda, I believe, on good authority, saw that if she forced a vote within the Republican side of that group, that Jean Theriault would be the president, and she would have to live under that thumb. And they did not like each other. And so...
And Lyda Green was from Palmer and represented the Mat-Su.
Right. Well, represented a portion of that, too.
Right.
So
she knew that if they just stayed with the Republicans, that Jean Theriault would be president. Lyda Green did not want Jean Theriault to be president, so she was looking for other options.
And so she cut a deal with the Democrats who'd been out of power for a generation. And the Democrats were like, yeah, sure. But they basically said there are things that everyone will be free to vote their conscience. And one of them was oil and gas policy. And so it was a marriage of convenience. They were further politically opposed between the Republican and the Democratic faction than the Republican minorities
and the Democratic faction.
And
it was kind of like the far right Republicans with the Democrats. I mean, that's not exactly right, but
there's
a way to frame that.
Yeah, a version of that. And so it made for a very odd structure.
And Liesl joined the majority.
Right. And so Liesl joined the majority.
Even though she would be a moderate Republican who might have been more at home with the moderate Republican minority.
Definitely. She was philosophically more aligned with the others, but she saw the opportunity for chairmanships and things. So she jumped. And so that dynamic was part of the playing field that we were operating in as we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we go about moving this gas project through? So the gas line deal, the gas line legislation had some decent amount of resistance up front. And then when the indictments came down and the arrests were made, that pretty much evaporated.
Like gas project was dead.
No.
Oh, the
opposition
to the gas project was dead.
And we pretty much were able to write the bill as we wanted to write it and rode through the rest of the session without too much opposition in terms of like you shall do this. It was more, well, what do you think about this? Like, okay, yeah, we can incorporate some of that in there.
This is AGIA.
AGIA. At the same time, the public discourse surrounding oil taxes had to be addressed because the indictments obviously put
Made
into
PPT
question.
look pretty bad.
PPT look bad. And to be perfectly candid, we were prepared for an oil tax discussion.
You weren't.
I had never looked at it before. I had, at DNR, you don't deal with taxes. You deal with royalty and you deal with the leases and taxes were something that those guys over at Revenue did. And so I wasn't conversant in it. So we needed to buy some time. And so I suggested to the governor that she publicly direct that the Commissioner of Revenue put together a study on how PPT is performing and that would be delivered in, I can't remember what we said, 3 months or something. And then she would take action based upon that study. And so that bought us some time to
So basically, while the study's being done, you're trying to learn.
I'll try to learn.
It's reminiscent of your first week on the job in Alaska and having to deal with ANCSA.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Yeah. So we got AGIA passed and then turned attention to taxes. And so now I've got my team over at Revenue working the taxes side and brought in some consultants. We also utilized the commercial group at DNR to run economic analysis of what different tax structures could do. But the first thing we did was looked at, okay, what did PPT return compared to what it was expected to return? And at just the basic top line level, the predictions of what the expenditures would be, when you net the costs off of the gross revenue, the claimed expenditures were significantly higher than what had been predicted. And so
that reduced the amount of money that you got.
That reduced the amount that the state received, even though because oil prices had gone up, the actual revenue had increased.
We got more money, but
we got
less than
expected. And so that provided a justification for changing the system.
Mm-hmm.
And so that then opened up. So that was announced. So we, again, had to kick the can down the road. And so sometime in July, governor announced that here's the report, shows the state's not getting what we thought we were going to get. She has lost confidence in PPT. She's directed the commissioner to come up with a proposal.
Direct the commissioner, which is you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, and to pull the curtain back. We wrote all this. So
right.
It's like, so governor, you're going to direct me to come up with a proposal
mm-hmm.
and you're going to give me until it was like first week of September or something to issue the proposal. And we would have a special session that would begin mid-October. And so we kind of set up this timeline so everybody knew what was coming and it could kind of quiet any suspicion that there wasn't going to be anything done or whatever. But it set a deadline for us to come up with an actual proposal. And the full expectation when we started was, okay, let's come up with a gross-based system with some credits for early investment that would balance out and replicate the economic system that a net-based tax would do. And so the modelers went about doing their thing to try to figure out which of the dials needed to be switched to which. And we had created a 12 field model that imagined 12 different types of new oil projects that come in with different costs, different production profiles, and then we would run the different types of scenarios against them and said, okay, this one results in a reduction of the net present value of this project by this amount. It increases the internal rate of return by this amount, whatever. So we could actually have some metrics to judge both from an industry perspective, what does this do to my investment decision? And from then we had the same thing handed over to our revenue side that would run it through the revenue projection model that would then say, okay, if you have that type of a system, you're going to end up with this amount of revenue. And that was all built upon the expected economic parameters of the existing fields, Prudhoe Bay and Park and such. And the problem that's inherent in coming up with a singular system is that you have these legacy fields that are basically being harvested with very little additional investment being made and huge profits coming off of them that become the primary generator of the revenue. While at the same time, you have these new projects that are going to initially lose money before they grow and to become profitable that you're trying to not damage through a aggressive tax structure. So you kind of want to be aggressive with the harvesters, but light with the new companies coming in. And maybe take a time out there to just talk a little bit about overall resource management strategy for oil and gas in Alaska. The primary concern that we had for the long-term growth of the potential, maximization of our potential oil and gas possibility was that we had ended up with a small number of producers who controlled all aspects of the North Slope oil and gas.
It's like an
industry.
oligarchy. An oligarchy of oil and gas companies.
So
a small number that controls almost everything.
Yeah. We had basically two producers. At that point, it was ConocoPhillips and BP. We had one that was potentially coming in the form of Exxon, but they were a working interest owner, but not an operator. And they dominated everything on the North Slope, and they created a huge
barrier to entry
for any new company. And that the only way that we would see the type of, so if you look at oil and gas basins around the world, they would all go through a similar set of development phases where you would have the elephant hunters, as they call them, the big multinational companies would come in and put in the initial infrastructure to develop the huge resources that were in the major pools of that basin. And that would last an entire generation in human life of industry and revenue and income and so forth. But as that would fall off, because you would naturally start depleting that field, then you would need to see independents and smaller capped companies willing to take on higher risks and smaller pools and have a larger number of companies that would then develop the next tranche. And in the aggregate, that tranche may be as big as the original fields at certain points of time, but they would be churned faster and they would generate a lot more economic activity because you'd have a diverse group of companies that were using a diverse group of services, and you would have a fairly sustained economic activity set for another generation before that would start to plateau and fall off. And Alaska never experienced that second one. And we were trying to create a environment that would potentially allow that second phase to take hold. And that was a big part of our philosophy for how to put together both the fiscal system and some of the other aspects of our management strategy. And so when we started to put together the building blocks for ACES, what
does ACES stand for?
Alaska's Clear and Equitable Share. So a GF, well, we recognized was the value of the naming and the acronym.
And AGIA is Alaska
Gas Line Inducement Act. And because AGIA was easier to say, it became something that everyone could identify, understood what it was. You could have shorthand conversations and it made things easier. And the public could go, oh, AGIA, okay, I like that, blah, 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 blah. And it would be part of the public conversation. With the oil tax, we needed something similar. And so it took a long time. It was actually...
Did you come up with it?
Elise did.
Elise did.
Yeah. I came up with all the different words that could fit into different descriptors of what we were trying to accomplish. And one morning, she just said, ACES, Alaska's Clear and Equitable Share. And I said, oh, that sounds good. I like that. And so I probably texted Governor Palin first. I was like, how about Alaska? She goes, I like it. That sounds good. Let's go with it. So that was it. And that became ACES after that. That was right near the end. That was probably like 2 days before our press conference because we were struggling to come up with the name. But we identified kind of midway through that a gross-based tax could not work, that we couldn't figure out a way to have a gross-based tax with other bells and whistles work to where it generated enough revenue from the legacy fields and also didn't overly burden new projects that were coming on. And so we had to suck it up and say, okay, we're going to need a net-based tax. But we also wanted to have, with a net-based tax, one of the vulnerabilities from the state's perspective is that if you're at a time of low oil prices, you could end up with very little revenue. And so we wanted to have a floor. And so the original ACES proposal was what we referred to as a hybrid tax. And this was both from a structural standpoint, a reasonable approach, but from a political standpoint, it was absolutely necessary because Palin had run on the fact that a net-based tax is not to be trusted, that she wanted to go back to a gross-based tax, and so on and so forth. And so she didn't want to end up proposing a net-based tax alone. So ACES was a hybrid. It had a high floor for a minimum tax, gross-based minimum tax on the legacy fields, and a net-based tax basically for anything above that floor. And so all's well. We proposed it. We did a number of public open houses to kind of get everybody comfortable with the concept and the terminology and the justification and all that. And then went into the special session. And at this point now, we're in October of 2007, the sense of sort of rolling over that the Republicans had done at the end of the AGIA session was no longer there. And there were a number of Republicans who felt that it would be in their interest to be the opposition to what Palin wanted and also align with the oil companies and so forth. And so we had a slog. And so I came in with a team of about probably 15 people between folks from revenue, folks from DNR, and consultants. And we would meet in my office every morning and give everybody their assignments and send them off to run around the building and check in with every legislator. And special sessions are nice because it's a one topic time and everyone is focused on one thing. You haven't experienced that yet, but they're kind of refreshing. And so then I spent the first week targeting individual meetings with probably about a dozen of the swing legislators who would be the ones on the margin and basically trying to get their temperature on what would be a package that would get me 21 and 11. And I ignored the basic power structure, didn't worry about leadership in either body, and just worried about
individual
2111.
votes. Yeah, votes.
And so we kind of hit upon it. And then I got to where I could count on about 20, I'd say 26 House and 13 or so in the Senate. And so we just pushed on that. And it got adjusted here and there throughout the legislative process, started in the House side in resources and finance. And then on the floor, had to deal with a couple things on the Democrat side that had to acquiesce to get the votes that we then stripped on the Senate side and then had to convince them on this.
Do you have a most memorable flip? Like someone that was initially opposed that you were able to get to support?
Harry Crawford.
So Democrat.
The Democrats were by far the hardest to get on board because they had been convinced that a gross-based tax is the only way to go. And
wow. So it's just like in retrospect, like how could they possibly have questioned what brought us so many billions of dollars?
Yeah. But they were convinced that the oil companies would outmaneuver and out account the state. And so we had initially in our initial proposal, we had some somewhat aggressive changes to the state disclosure laws to provide more transparency, more public confidence in the accounting and the way that the expenses are reported. And a lot of that got stripped in order to get to 2111. And that was disappointing. And I think it did serve it well in the long run. But yeah, so yeah, and the Harry thing was frustrating on a number of fronts.
So just for listeners, Harry Crawford represented Muldoon in the House. He replaced Ramona Barnes, former Speaker of the House.
And Harry was a huge labor supporter. He was a laborer himself, and he was very stubborn, to his credit. And so he just didn't trust the companies. And so he then, in the 11th hour, after we'd kind of reached the deal that I could get through both bodies, Harry said he wanted what he called a standard deduction. He said, in order to protect the state in the first couple of years, we should establish what the companies are allowed to deduct for the first 2 years or something, maybe 4 years, I can't remember.
But I'll just jump out and say, in my limited perspective from what we've talked about already, that would benefit the big players, the old players who've been there forever, and would penalize the new companies that would be coming in?
Not necessarily. What he wanted to do is he wanted to say, okay, we're just going to take the deductions that they reported this year, and we're going to just add 2% or something to it, and not allow them to actually deduct what they actually spent.
Yeah.
And that will, protect the state from a wildly unexpected increase in the number of expenditures that they would take. And I didn't like it because it was distortionary. It distorted what the actual economic behavior was. It undermined the whole premise of a net-based tax, which is for every dollar that you spend, you're going to save, whatever your marginal tax rate is on it. And so that provides an incentive for you to invest. And if you're not going to be able to actually deduct it, then it doesn't actually incentivize you to spend. But Harry demanded, before he would vote, he wanted a meeting with the governor. And so I'd kind of prepped the governor that I don't really like this, but this is what Harry is demanding. And he went in and he convinced her. And she said, I like this. Let's do it. And man, did that cause me problems. And so then I had to go back through the whole system and get everyone back on board. And it almost squirreled us on the House floor, definitely almost squirreled us on the Senate floor. And man, it just made life a little more difficult. But to Harry's credit, he got it through. And at the end of the day, he, I think, legitimately claimed that it resulted in, $200-300 million more to the state than what they probably would have claimed in terms of their expenses. And so that benefited the state. But it definitely caused a big heartburn.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so yes, that was one of the flips. Yeah, so we got ACEs passed in November of 2007. And at this point, what people, I think, fail to really remember is that I think in late 2007, early 2008, there were a number of public opinion polls that came out. And Sarah Palin's approval rating among all Alaskans was like 87%. And that's Republican, Democrat, whatever.
She was killing it.
She was killing it. And that was what created the wind at our back in terms of being able to put in these fairly aggressive oil and gas policies. And that got the legislature to go along. With ACEs, there's little things like we hit the Senate Finance Committee and we're basically told this will not pass in its current form. LIDA wants the tax rate brought down to what it passed with PPT because otherwise it's going to look like it was corrupt when PPT passed, and we don't want the symbolism of that. And Palin said, no, we're going to have a change because we want something that's very different than PPT, and it's going to be 25%. And we were at loggerheads, and I got a call from Liesl one night that said, okay, tonight's the night. If they don't agree to release it out of Finance Committee, a number of us are going to jump and name Gene Theriault. We got all the Democrats on board, and we're going to reorganize the Senate. And the next morning, they released it out of the Finance Committee as it was.
Wow!
So, lot of drama, and we ultimately got it through. So the session is only 30 days. When we started the session, all the modeling was based upon a $60 oil price with a high side of like 85 to 90. By the end of the session, we were running $80 base case with a high side of 120 because oil prices were moving so rapidly upward. And so everyone kind of, to a certain extent, lost sight of the downside. And so we had to, in order for me to get to 2111, I had to agree to get rid of the floor. But we increased what at the time was called progressivity. We increased the take at the higher end of the profit scale.
Thinking that it probably would never come into play.
Thinking that it would only come into play temporarily because there's a certain equilibrium that happens when oil prices are up, services start to cost more, the dollar per barrel profit reduces, and you end up coming back down the scale. Even though the oil price may stay high, the profit scale will come back down per barrel and you'll end up in a different place. But we did not anticipate how high it got. We also did not anticipate that in the Senate Finance Committee, they raised the ceiling. Our proposal had capped the tax rate at, I think it went from 25 to a high of 35 and 35%. And then I think during the process that cap might have been raised to 40 in Senate Finance in the last, when they're arguing about whether or not we should raise it the floor from 22.5 to 25, they came back with their committee substitute and they eliminated the ceiling all the way up to 50 and then had it go up from there. And so it was like, oh my God, it went out to just 75%, I think, at the upper scale. That turned out to be a strategic blunder because it provided a talking point for the industry to say that it taxes at a high rate of 75% or something like that.
So Sarah becomes vice presidential candidate. She ends up resigning as governor. Parnell becomes governor. What had happened to you during that period?
Not too much. I mean, the day that Sarah resigned, we were all called to her house to be props for her press conference. And out in the driveway, then Lieutenant Governor Parnell told us all that he intended to keep the same team, keep moving with the same agenda, and so forth. And so from that point, so now a lot had happened since then because you had the global economic crash, you had oil prices cratering from 144 down to in the teens, then recovering back up shortly thereafter. The stock market had crashed, permanent fund earnings had become negative. A lot had gone on in that 2008 timeframe. So by the time she was resigning in it would have been July of 2009, we were playing mostly defense on ACEs and also to a certain extent on AGEA. And so that was primarily the exercise for the next year and a half, was to provide a public answer to the misinformation and other things that was going on in the public discourse. And Sean was fine with that. And I made a couple runs at trying to get some more aggressive legislation considered that were rejected. It was basically hold the line and just ride it out steady till the end, till his next election. And so he got reelected. And at that point, then we were told that we were all gone, ostensibly.
Who replaced you?
Brian Butcher. Brian Butcher replaced me, and I was offered a role running the Alaska Energy Authority, and I wasn't interested in that.
Were you sad when you found out that Parnell wasn't going to keep you on and that everyone was getting replaced?
I would say sad. It was a little disconcerting because it was a little bit of hiding the ball, that Parnell had run his campaign as a continuation of the Palin administration, that those things that you liked that the Palin administration did, we're going to do without the drama, and then immediately sacked us and started to move towards adopting a very, very different oil and gas approach. And so that was frustrating, just from a state policy perspective. From a personal perspective, no.
And watching the undoing of ACES, was that painful?
Oh, eventually? Yeah. It wasn't, what was painful was that we had spent a lot of time trying to increase the intelligence of the state's analysis of what a fiscal system should be and what the pros and cons are of different changes. And that seemed to have all washed out of the system. And so the public dialogue became much blunter and much less sophisticated in terms of analyzing what should or shouldn't be done. And that was frustrating because I thought that we had built up a better infrastructure for the state decision making, and that didn't hold. The fact that they changed it was frustrating. It was definitely frustrating, but it was also in the context of significantly lower oil prices. There was a big confusion in the public discourse over what the drop in revenue was attributable to the change in the oil tax structure versus the oil price structure. And that was frustrating to watch just because there's a lot of confusion and
Misinformation.
And not directly, some of it was intentionally misinformation, but a lot of it was just unfortunate misinformation from people who just didn't understand how the system worked. And so the debate became less fact-based and more emotional. And that was disappointing for me. I ended up back in private practice with a firm in Anchorage with the intent of helping new oil companies that were coming up to the state. That was sort of what I felt would be most valuable, was to use my expertise to help new companies navigate because of these barriers to entry. I still believe strongly that the state's long-term interests were served by having new companies come in and break up the oligopoly that exists on the slope. And so I could serve as a translator and ambassador to bring them in and help them navigate a very, very complex environment. And so two things that came to light very early on. One was I hate being a hourly billable hour lawyer. It just sucks. Not only because your life is only valued by the hours that you spend, but also when you're working with a client, you're treated as a cost as opposed to a team member. And so you're only given the information you need to complete whatever task they give you, and you're not given all the information. And my enjoyment comes from solving problems and taking in a lot of information and figuring out how to resolve it and come up with the best solution. And when I'm limited to only a certain fragment of that information, then it frustrates me. And so that was one thing. Second was that I got hired by a new company called Great Bear Petroleum that was just starting out on the slope with a whole new concept for how to approach oil and gas. And I enjoyed that. But again, I was kept at arm's length. And then a year into it, they offered me a job in-house. And so I got to basically jump out of the world I hated and into a team. And that started a whole different adventure with a company that then evolved 3 or 4 times over the last 12 years to where we are today.
One last question, you don't have to answer it. Why did you let go of your Democrat Party affiliation?
That happened at a particular moment when Biden refused to drop out of the race. And I just felt that I couldn't support an institution that was allowing that to take place anymore. And that was a long time coming. You know, I'm not a very strong partisan, working for multiple Republican administrations and having a large number of Republican friends and such. It was an identity that in part might go back to just being counter to my dad as a rebel. But
Like your dad was a Republican, so you were a Democrat?
yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, I don't think that was as clean, but it was a formative world philosophy was that the view that the Democrats had towards making the world better from the bottom up was more aligned with my interests than one from the top down.
Well, Pat Galvin, thanks so much for being on the show today.
You're welcome, Representative Gray.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-465-4940.